Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the And She Looked Up podcast. As always, I'm your host, Melissa, and this week I am really excited to be welcoming author Kim Fahner to the post office. I was going to say the post office to the podcast. Welcome to the show, Kim. It's lovely to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. For those of you who may not be familiar with Kim, she lives, writes, and teaches in Sudbury, Ontario. And her debut novel, The Donoghue Girl, which was published by Latitude 46, just came out a couple of weeks ago. Her next book, the is a poetry book called The Pollination Field, and is being published by Turnstone Press, and that's going to be out this coming spring. And Kim is also the first vice chair of the Writers Union of Canada. So we're going to be talking about all of that today, along with some other things. But Kim, the first question I ask everyone who comes on the show is, did you feel like you were creative as a kid growing up?
Yeah, I totally did actually. I was sort of always on the outskirts of popular kids because I read a lot. So
Mhm.
I escaped into books, and I think I was writing stories, like creative stories and little poems when I was in elementary school. I didn't forecast it being like something I would do for my life alongside my work, daily work, but yeah, I was always reading and then playing with words on the paper. I couldn't paint for the life of me though. Like I couldn't do visual art when I was in high school or elementary school. So, but the words just sort of gave me a safe place, a refuge from the world. So,
Yeah, it's always interesting how many people associate being creative with being a visual artist when there's
yeah.
so many ways we can be creative as I think everyone's creative and I think we all have our own way of channeling that creativity.
Yeah.
But at what point did you realize that writing is something you could actually do as a career? When did you have that moment or epiphany?
Probably in my 20s, I guess. I had a small chapbook of poems published by a local press called Scrivener, your Scrivener Press. And then after that, I started getting my next books that were full books of poetry. And I started to realize, okay, I can't make a living at this. But it wasn't really ever about making money. It was about the words just kept coming, the ideas kept coming, and I knew I had to write them down.
Mhm.
So, it's been intertwined with my work as a teacher for 23 years at least. And before that, before I began teaching, even in other jobs I had in my 20s, I just constantly wrote. So, it's hard for me to separate writing from anything else. It's just parallel to my teaching career or any other jobs I've had. It's just part of who I am. And I guess that's why creativity is cool too.
What kind of teacher are you? You mentioned before we started talking that you're a high school teacher, but what do you teach?
I've taught English for a long, long time, and I also do special education.
Okay.
So
So,
that's really fascinating and rewarding too, working one-on-one with kids.
mhm. And it's not often I work with a lot of writers. I've met a lot of writers. I've had writers on the show, but it's not often I come across one who is known for poetry or who gravitates to poetry. And so what made you go that route? Your first novel that just came out last month is not your first book, but it is your first novel. You are much better known as a poet. And yeah, what is it about poetry that makes it special for you?
It's funny, I remember reading things like Tennyson and The Lady of Shalott in high school and thinking they were cool. And I really loved Shakespeare in high school, which was really poetry. I had great
Hmm.
English teachers in high school. I took a writer's craft course with Mr. Carter when I was in grade 13, OAC English, and he really encouraged me. And poetry, for some reason, just seemed to come to me almost, I feel like it's almost a way of being and breathing. So even when I write novels or short stories or plays or essays, it's very poetic in terms of the prose I'm writing.
Hmm.
And it's very strange actually when I think about it. It's like I'll see something and want to write about it out in the natural world. I have a link between seeing something visual and wanting to write it
Oh, that's
too.
so interesting. No, that is really interesting that that's just how your brain processes it. Like that's,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, The other thing that made me very curious when I was doing my research on you is it's not often that you come across a poet, a Canadian poet, who has published as many books as you have. You've written five full poetry collections that have been published. You've also written two chapbooks, and maybe we should just mention what a chapbook is for the audience because I don't think it's a term a lot of people are familiar with.
A chapbook's really a smaller collection. So in England, I think they call them pamphlets instead of full books of
Okay.
poems. So they might be 20, 25, 30 pages of poetry, almost like a taster of something so it could be a chapbook could include maybe a section in a larger book of poetry. So there are more presses like Ian Letourneau's press called Emergency Flash Mob is out of Fredericton, and he's publishing chapbooks now. And there are other ones across the country as well. So my first book was a chapbook and it sort of was well received. And then I found a publisher who wanted to publish a full book. So
Because that I think is the stumbling block that I hear from a lot of people who love poetry or love writing poetry, but they've always felt that for whatever reason, they will not become published as a poet. Their path to being published is a novel. And yet you have gone the opposite route. You've written five poetry collections before writing a novel. And how were you able to make that happen? And if there's people out there listening wondering how they could possibly get published as a poet, what would you suggest to them?
I would say I think you need to read a lot of poetry. I read it every day, and even if I don't write it every day, I read poetry every day. And when I'm writing a certain genre, I'll try to read that genre so my head turns to that
Hmm.
perspective of genre. But for publishing, I just had great mentors coming through my 20s who encouraged me to submit to journals across Canada. And it took a long time. So I really didn't start to get more and more pieces published till I was in my 30s, like in journals, but I had already had a couple of books published that it's kind of I went about it backwards in a way. Um, but I think you can get published. I think it's about sending your work out to journals and not just to contests. I feel like people put their eggs in the basket of literary contests, and I think it's great to do that, but not to just do that. And then an emerging writer I was mentoring said to me, "Well, I don't like being rejected." So I don't send out to journals, but I think if you can actually it's about why you're writing. Are you writing just to get published or are you writing just to, get the idea out on paper, hopefully share it? Yes, of course you want it published, but if your sole goal is to rush to publish, I don't know. I feel like sometimes it does take time. It's not impossible. And so I think also finding people who can mentor you and encourage you is
Hmm.
really, really important, especially in poetry. It's a really unique genre.
Hmm. It is, yeah.
Yeah.
And um, I think there's always this feeling that it's just not commercially viable.
Yeah,
But yeah,
I
unfortunately.
know. I guess, I have the best poetic community across Canada and across other parts of the world from
Hmm.
all the people I've met, and they're the coolest people I know are poets. Poets and visual artists and singer-songwriters and actors and that kind of and playwrights. I don't know. I feel maybe if you're going to be a poet, you kind of know it's not about making $1 million, right?
Hmm.
So there are very few that will reach that kind of plateau in that genre. But I'm idealistic this way. I feel like you should just create because you feel this drive to create and then send it out and hopefully it does get published. I think but if you just tie it to monetary things, then I don't know. I doubt that many people can make a live. I don't. I don't know anyone who can. I mean, Rupi Kaur is a good example of someone, but she's rare. Billy
Yeah.
Collins might be,
Yeah.
in the States, someone, Mary Oliver. So that kind of commercialized success, I can't, possibly, I think that's there, but I don't see it happening very often.
And this year you published your first full-length novel. Big
Yeah.
change in genre. It's called The Donoghue Girl. And maybe just tell us a little bit about the book, first of all, and what it's about.
It's based on a family rumor, really, a story. So, my great grandfather was James Cornelius Kelly, and he was the first recorded merchant in Creighton, which was a tiny mining town outside of Sudbury. It's gone now. It's a company town, and sometimes they just disappear.
Yeah.
Company just scrapes them off or moves houses out. So, I had heard stories about Creighton from my great aunts and my grandmother, and the story that I heard was that my maternal grandfather dated my great aunt Nora Kelly, dumped her and married my grandmother Alice Kelly. And I thought I had never heard this. And two of my great aunts, when I was in my late 20s, they were closer to 80 then, said this. And I thought, what? That can't be true. And then no one could tell me whether or not the story was true. Different people thought it was not true. And I just thought, it doesn't matter. It's an interesting enough piece that I could create this world in this unique place in Northern Ontario because I feel so often that regionalized literature and stories are forgotten.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I feel like I've always written from this area. I've traveled around and I've lived in other places, but this place is really beautiful and raw and also just disturbing sometimes just because of the way mining works, right?
Hmm. Hmm. What made you decide to tackle a long form novel? It's so different from a poem or from poetry.
No. I've been writing short stories for years, so I worked with Timothy Finley as a mentor through the Humber School for Writers back in my late 20s, and he was very encouraging of my short prose work. And then in 2014, 15, I took a playwriting course with a fellow named Matthew Haiti up here at the Sudbury Theatre Center. And one exercise was to write a monologue or a scene that could be a one-act play. And I wrote something about this story that was in my head. And I said to Matthew, I think it's bigger. And he said, I think it should be bigger too. And I said, I can't manage going from the city of a poem to the country of a novel, you
That's a good
know?
way to put it. Yeah.
I can't see how to build the architecture of that structure. And he just said, just build it as you would a play, scene by scene. And so his encouragement was really important. And then I worked with Marnie Woodrow, who's a book coach, and back then she kind of worked alongside me, and I was learning craft there. And then I worked with Lawrence Hill at Banff in 2016 on an earlier draft of this piece. So those are the four people for me as a prose writer, whether short or long, who have been really instrumental in how I've managed to sort of conceptualize and then write a longer piece.
And now so obviously the story's been with you for a long time and you've been working on this for quite some time. And now
Yeah.
that it's out there into the world, do you think there's another novel in your system? Did you enjoy it enough that you would go down that route? Or um,
I'm almost finished another novel that's a modern contemporary novel. So, um, yeah, I'm hooked on it. I think just because I love the idea that if I have an idea for a story, something in my head tells me this is just a poem. This might be a creative nonfiction essay. This might be a short story. Something now it's almost like a switch goes off and I can tell what genre should be which story, you know?
that's really cool that you
Yeah.
can kind of conceptualize it that way. Um, I don't
Well,
know a lot of
yeah.
writers who could do that, or so I think that's really neat that you're able to kind of see that in your head of where, and not only see it, but execute in each of those genres. So that's,
Yeah, well, there are lots of people. I'm thinking of people I know who are multi-genre writers, like Gary Barwin writes poetry, essays, novels. Tanis MacDonald writes poetry and essays. So some of the people that I'm colleagues with as a writer, I can see that they're able to. Um, yeah, I don't know when that started happening. It feels fluid to me, and maybe that's what, we were thinking
hmm
about the creative process, that it's really fluid and that I maybe can't box it. And that maybe initially I thought I had to box it because I remember saying to Larry Hill at Banff, I said, I am just a poet. And he said, No, you're a writer. And
mm.
I that blew my mind because then I thought, what does that mean? Because people will just define me as a poet, and some people have for many, many years now, like 30 years. So this is a big shift for them, but I've been writing other genres in between as this took 10 years from start to finish. So
Huh.
I'm a
Yeah.
slow novel writer.
Well, you've got a second one under your belt now, it sounds
Yeah,
like. So,
yeah,
production's
almost
ramping up.
done. Almost done.
No, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way, the fluidity of it, but as a visual artist, I'm an illustrator and I'm a graphic designer, and I work in different mediums as an illustrator. And I never thought of it, like you said, it's very fluid. But they're both visual arts. So
Yeah.
I hadn't really thought about it that way. So you just made me think about it in a whole different different way.
Yeah.
Um, One of the things I wanted to talk to you about that I saw in as I was doing my research is you are an editor for Consilience, which I had never heard of until reading this, but it sounds so cool. It's an online journal that explores where the sciences and the arts meet. And this is something that I find so interested because we have actually had a lot of scientists on the show who are now artists and creatives, a few with their PhDs in the sciences. And I think people think they are two completely separate things, and yet there's so much creativity in the sciences. And so, yeah, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that, or tell me a little bit more. This is what I want to know about.
Well, that journal was begun by a fellow named Sam Illingworth, and he's really brilliant, and he works on the conjunction of science and poetry. I think when you think about it, scientists do the same things that poets do, which is to look very closely and to examine things and then see them in terms of, you could look at a certain butterfly and see it in terms of a whole other, the implications inside a bigger system. And I think that's what poets do too. They look at particulars, but then sort of point to universals, right?
hmm
So I found that really interesting. And then I think I'm really drawn to eco poetry, just given the state of the world and the natural world and how we've been so destructive as humans over the times we've been here. That I've been writing eco poetry, but I didn't know what it was, and I write ekphrastic poetry as well. So these kinds of poetry were always there, and sometimes they dovetail, but
What
I think,
what
sorry.
are those? No, no, I'm just for myself and for the audience, like
Yeah.
what is kind of the definition of eco poetry? And sorry, what was the other one that you mentioned?
Ekphrastic.
Ekphrastic? Okay,
Yeah.
that I've never heard of. So what are those exactly?
So eco poetry is poetry that speaks to the natural world
Okay.
and so raises awareness about environmentalism, really. So there's some fantastic writers, and just thinking about the positioning of how we write about the world as we move through it. And in times that are really bleak, when you look at climate change, and now it's not climate change, but climate crisis, right?
hmm
Um, I'm thinking of Joanna Lilly's beautiful book, Endlings, which is about she's written a book of wonderful poems about um, at risk and extinct species over time. And just the number of these poems where she researched these little creatures, animals to insects, across the board, just to see that that's shocking when you actually see the sort of like roll call of animals and creatures. And then Yvonne Blomer's wonderful work as an eco poet has been really instrumental for me. I think there are a lot of women eco poets out
That's
there. So,
interesting.
yeah, and a number of great Canadian eco poets who are just really mindful of how you can use the art of poetry to raise awareness. And that's what Sam's doing with Consilience, you know. I believe what the work he's doing is really important. And it's interesting because being an editor on that journal, I get to see scientists who write poetry. And then I'm trying to, because my head is not that sciencey, but they are very sciencey.
Hmm.
And it's interesting to see how they're making poetry from what their specific field is. They
Yeah.
also have particular fields, just like poets might.
Hmm.
So, and then the other definition is ekphrastic poetry, and that's poetry that's inspired by visual art, actually.
Oh,
So,
okay. That's interesting.
so yeah, so I've written various suites of poetry on Frida Kahlo, Georgia O'Keeffe, Mary Pratt, Maud Lewis.
Oh, that's so
Um,
cool.
yeah, I'm really interested in how these women artists manage at the times when they lived. And sometimes their partners were really not nice humans, you know.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
how did they manage to create these wonderful things? And sometimes that the men they were with overshadowed them, but they still sort of like even with Mary Pratt, she sort of like was eclipsed by Christopher and then rose above him after. And I just think there's something really feminist about it. But I'm fascinated by women artists, and I write mostly about women artists. I did write a couple of pieces about Alex Colville's work because of the just the photographic sort of like beauty of his work. That sort of,
Hmm.
Christopher Pratt, Alex Colville work is just so stunning.
That's really cool. I'm gonna have to find some of your stuff that you've written on that because that really speaks to me as an
Yeah,
artist. So yeah. No, it just I hadn't heard of the journal until
good.
reading about you, and I'm just like this is really cool. I have to know more about this. So now you mentioned earlier in the interview that you don't make a full-time living from poetry, and I think most of us working creatives have
Yeah.
multiple revenue streams. So tell
Yeah.
us a little bit about the things you do outside of writing as well.
I teach full time. I'm a high school teacher, so I've taught since I've been teaching high school English. I did a year of teaching history. I've done some work in the guidance department, student success and resource and special education at a high school here in town. It was a girls' school called Marymount Academy. It's where I went to school. Um, and I sort of I sort of marinate the kids in poetry if they're in my class. Because some teachers through the levels of grades avoid poetry. So when I was laureate here, I was poet laureate in Sudbury. I made a point of trying to get into classrooms in other places around the region
Hmm.
just because I felt like sometimes teachers are afraid of teaching poetry because it's something that people are alienated by when really it should be something that's accessible and that you should feel invited into. Not that it's difficult or elitist, that there's a voice for everyone. And I love using creative writing with kids because they have a lot to say. They're really brilliant teenagers. People don't listen to them enough, I don't think,
No,
you
I
know?
think you're right. I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah. And not everyone can paint or draw. And so I always try to dig into people creatively through writing in my classes just to see what comes out because it's fascinating and I also think it's helpful for them to work through things in their own lives if they can write or express however they do that they can skate dance
Hmm.
play football it doesn't matter as long as they're expressing themselves I feel they should have a buffet of choices to feel more okay with who they are because mental health is a big issue for teenagers, right? And for adults,
Absolutely.
but yeah.
Yeah, but I think when you learn the tools as a teenager to help you deal with it, which you and I we were talking before recording, we're very close in age, and that is not something that we were given as teenagers. But when you get those tools or you have access to those tools as a teenager, it helps you out so much as an adult. To understand that, yeah, journaling or writing or painting something really huge on a canvas can really help
Yeah.
you work through so many things. And
Yes.
yeah, yeah,
So many kids did crochet work through the pandemic and knitting. They would come back after the pandemic was starting to, because we were in quadmesters and then we came back part-time and part
yeah,
virtual hybrid. And then they came back and they were like, Miss, I have this scarf. And so they had done that. And I just thought that's the coolest. Or they had learned, they'd focused on cooking. And I thought, so there's so many ways to be creative. And if we can get
yeah,
our kids doing that, I think you're right. They'll be better set for life because life as an adult is hard.
yeah. It was hard as a teenager. I wouldn't go back to
Yeah.
that for any money.
No, it's hard. Yeah.
So, yeah, absolutely. No, I think I love it when I see. I always felt in school that if you weren't an athlete, there wasn't very many places for you,
Yes.
especially as a kid who was, quintessentially creative.
Right.
There was drama club, and that was about it.
Yeah.
Um, and I feel like if we put as much emphasis on the creative arts, or like you said, whatever, as we do on sports in
Whatever.
high school, I feel like
Yes.
that would be helpful to so many kids.
Yeah, for sure.
Yes. Um, one of the things that has been really apparent, not just reading about you, but also just talking to you, is you take community very seriously. You are obviously very involved in your own writing community, but in the Canadian writing community as a whole. You are the first vice chair for the Writers Union of Canada, among other things. Uh, Maybe tell us a little bit about, first of all, what the Writers Union of Canada does and what it is that you do there.
Um, well, we just celebrated our 50th anniversary about a year ago. So it's an organization that was established to sort of, unite writers, but also fight for the rights of writers because, and now currently it's a fight for copyright
Yes.
law. Um, just even in post-secondary and education, copying books and it just does not work for any of us. So that's a big thing. A big part of our focus is to make sure that we fight for copyright law reform and that writers are properly compensated, that, there are things like universal income that might be of interest. So we have so many programs that are great for people. We have webinars every month, and there's a mentorship micro grant so we can have emerging writers mentored by more veteran ones,
Mhm.
and creating community is what TWUC is about. It's the Writers Union of Canada. We call it TWUC.
Twuck, okay.
Yeah. So, and it's just, I came to it before the pandemic and I was volunteering on one of the committees. And then someone said, "Oh, you should be Ontario rep." So then I thought, "Oh, I'll be Ontario rep." And I sort of created an open mic night during the pandemic online. And then I did a newsletter just to create community because we were so far apart then. We forget how hard that was, right?
It was, yeah.
Yeah.
And yet
And
it was
yeah,
artists who kind of all came
I
together and
know.
you had people reading bedtime
Yes.
stories on YouTube and doing all kinds of
Yes.
things. And so I think if ever there was a point where we proved how important we are to the world, it was during that first part of the pandemic where nobody knew what to do when they were stuck at home. And they realized how much
Yeah.
they relied on Netflix and all these
Right?
other things where, you need creatives and creators to create all that art that you
Because
consume.
how would people have been mentally through that time if they didn't have access to all that? Like the
Yeah.
time and place of this pandemic was good in the fact that you could access the arts online,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
But I still think we're taken for granted. And I think of cuts to the arts nationally, provincially across this country,
Yeah.
was having to fight even in municipalities for certain grants. I just think we're always, as artists, having to sort of prove the value of art. You would think you're right, though, that would have been a turning point, but that's one part of
No.
12 I love is that we still fight for. for those things to be recognized and properly compensated, you know?
Yeah. Do you worry about this wasn't one of the questions I put at you beforehand, but do you worry about speaking of copyright, like where AI is going and you
Um,
yeah.
I knew you were going to say AI.
Is it just
Listen,
you
I
can't
totally knew
escape
it.
it.
Oh
You
my
can't,
gosh, so worried.
yeah. It's
Worried. It's a new part of what we're talking about at TWEC because it's a different kind of copyright law
mhm.
enforcement because it's just ridiculous to me that some kind of force can gather up books instantaneously, sort of learn from them, and then write something in the style of an author that
It's
does
like
seem similar. I don't think
it's
I'm
it's
very anti-AI.
it's like locusts hitting a field, and just like and consuming it all in seconds flat and just leaving this barren landscape. And I just feel from a copyright perspective, the world is not keeping up and is so hard to once the genie's out of the bottle, you can't put it back in, right? You so
Yeah.
it's just going to be catch up, constant catch up. And I mean, I'm not afraid of AI as a tool. I do use it from things, but I don't agree with this concept that it can just take what we create and amalgamate it and spit it back out in various forms that without compensation for what we're doing. That just doesn't sit well with me at all.
Well, how do you regulate this thing? It's
I
like
don't
a
know.
Pandora's box that's been opened. It's like your genie in the bottle metaphor, right? I just feel it's very scary, I think. And if you're creative, the question is, well, what's creativity and what makes a human and
Yeah.
where does that creative spark come from? And that takes time. All of us as creatives take time to create whatever we're creating. And the fact that something can sort of like gobble it up and spit it out in some other form that's like our form, and then for us not to be compensated, I just think there's so many ethical issues here. And I don't
Hmm.
think it's going to get simpler. I think it's going to be a larger, harder fight. But I think we have to keep speaking up against it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I know I can keep creating. I'm a creative. I'm a creator. That's what I do. And I can keep creating. I'm not worried about that part of it. And I
Oh,
know there will always be people who will want my original work. But yeah, it's this underlying piece of the fact that my work can just be gobbled up.
gross.
It is gross,
Yeah,
really,
it's
when you
gross.
think
It's
about it.
very sort of like zombie-like almost, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. And
But I feel like there's a lack of ethics and morals, and then I know, it's big money, it's big business, and then so many writers, so many artists of any ilk or genre are living close to the poverty line, even in a gig economy, right? A contract economy, people with like four or five different jobs and being a creative on the side, they're still living close to the poverty line. There's not a lot of writers who make enough money to work full time and support themselves, you know? There might
yeah.
be a few. I'm sure there are, but most people I know have day jobs and then write on the side and then, you know,
Yeah. Yeah. It's something I think about. I think we all think about it
ah,
a lot.
sure.
And it just feels like it's promoting mediocrity. I don't,
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
it's yeah. It's just the stuff that, I will often sit down with ChatGPT and I use it for the podcast to help me put together a podcast outline, or
Right?
anything. But anytime I use it to write product descriptions on my website and it churns it out and it's like, okay, but it
What's
needs to be fixed. It doesn't like it just sounds generic. I need to make this sound cool,
being human, like the human
Yes.
aspect's missing.
Yeah.
I can tell as an English teacher, if somebody hands in an essay that's chat GPT pretty much.
Hmm.
Some people would argue with me, but it's kind of devoid of a voice. It has all the stuff that it might need at the basic level, but there's no sort of individual spark there. I
Yeah.
think that's where our individual creativity, our spirit, whatever, um, is it. I mean, look at the different artists through history. They're all so unique.
Hmm.
We're all so different, but we're coming from the same place creatively, but we're all kind of unique in our whatever we do inside our genres.
Yeah.
To think that you could try to it drives me a bit bonkers to be honest, because I worry about it a great deal.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I honestly try not to think about it too much right
I
now because
know.
it depresses me.
I keep well, and I think what you said is really important. We keep creating. So
hmm
regardless of what that's doing, and regardless, we keep fighting against those things that might you know, be detrimental to the creation of art.
Yeah. Yes. And this is where I think community actually plays a really big role is when you are able to surround yourself with other artists, either in your field or in completely unrelated creative fields, or even fields that aren't creative, but
Yeah.
also building a community of people who love what you do and want to read your books or buy your art or whatever. And so this is one of the things that we were going to talk about for the last little bit of the interview is yeah, like you're working with the Writers Union of Canada and like what is it for you personally that you get out of this idea of community? Why is it you're so drawn to it? Because you obviously are. Um,
Yeah, I've always been really involved in community volunteer work since I was young. I mean, I remember having to do 40 hours to graduate high school in Ontario. I'm
yeah.
pretty sure that's probably common for most people. And then my parents were grand volunteers. And so I just saw them going out at night to meetings, and things like that. And they always sort of instilled in me the value of giving back to the community in which you
Mhm.
live. So I've been on volunteer committees here in Sudbury my whole life, really. And then I turned towards TWUC, just focusing on that in a different sort of community in a larger aspect. But yeah, I've volunteered my whole life. So
And being a writer, like writing can be a very solitary pursuit
yes.
for a lot of us. Um, did you feel like you needed like a support network almost? I don't know if that's the right word for it, but just to kind of have other writers around you that you could talk to, bounce ideas off for. Because I always get the feeling, no matter what area I'm working in, there's always my last business, we used to put on a conference, a 3-day conference, and where people could come and it was for bloggers, food bloggers, and they
Cool.
would come and they would get to, learn about photography and SEO and all that stuff. And the most common thing we heard at the end in the conference evaluations was, I'm really just here for the people, or I'm just
Yeah.
here to talk to all my peers. This is the only opportunity I get to meet with my peers. I wish we had more time to network. I wish we had more time to chat. And I honestly said to my business partner, we could scrap the workshops and we could just put them all in a big room
Yes.
for a couple of days. And I think they'd be really happy. Because I feel like for so many of us, we don't get that connection. It's not like a job where you go to an office every day and you have people that you can talk to and all that. And so, yeah, do you get that feeling from a lot of the writers and other creatives that you talk to that that's something they really need?
I think that's a large part of the union is, some people would call it networking. I don't feel like that's what it is. For me, it's building community. It's like an extended family
It's a
across.
support.
That's
It's
right.
yeah, and you mentioned mentorship multiple
That's huge.
times earlier.
Yeah, I believe in that a great deal. I do it here locally with emerging writers, and I've worked with people nationally. I feel that I didn't initially, as a young emerging writer, have a mentor. I had some teachers who were brilliant and
hmm
some university professors at Laurentian who were brilliant and encouraging me. But um, yeah, I think mentorship is huge. And I also just think when you talk about volunteerism, that whole notion, you're going to hopefully find people with similar values, right?
Yeah.
And not everybody volunteers, but the people I choose to associate with do. So, not all of them are, it doesn't mean just because you volunteer, you're this perfect person. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to
Right.
say, I like the notion that we think we can leave the world a better place after we've gone. that
Yeah.
we have a legacy in how we give back to younger generations. And for me, I think as a teacher of young people, I like chose a profession where I'm doing that every day.
Yeah.
Um, it's like planting seeds for the future. And that also, I think, happens with my work in TWUC, like just the notion that you're encouraging younger writers and that that's a legacy, that's a living legacy.
Yeah.
I think. I worry about volunteerism though, because I often hear, well, it's not paid work. And I understand that it's so hard, right, with this economy to volunteer on top of working. And it's a choice you make to volunteer. Um, because sometimes the work I do as a volunteer for TWUC is a large amount of time on top of my job. And I don't ever resent it. I love it.
Mm, that's a good sign then that it's
Yeah.
the fit for you.
Mhm.
I hear that often with people who
Yeah.
don't want to mentor or anything is like, "Oh, it's not paid. I don't have the time." And yet I feel like you get just as much back from it as you put into it. Like it's not always about, I mean, yeah, money's great. I like money, but I also like to feel, and this takes the altruism out of it, I guess, but I like to feel like I helped somebody see something they might not have seen on their own.
It's good.
Like if I could just
Yeah.
kind of point them in the right direction so that they can keep growing or whatever it is that they're trying to do. And that just is immensely self-satisfying. Like,
Well, that's teaching.
yes, it is.
Oh,
And I
it's
actually started out to
yeah.
be a teacher. That's
Oh,
the
well, there you go. Because you're describing what we do,
yeah.
educators do every day, which is not
Yeah.
it's funny. I always think people think we tell kids what they need to learn, but I think it's about asking them questions to make them think differently or to see other pathways and possibilities
Hmm.
and go, oh, I had this one way of looking at it, but now we've had this big conversation in class and it's expanded to make me think about other possible viewpoints. So then they go out thinking and questioning things, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Now we live in a country that's just geographically huge
it is.
and it's very, very rural in most of it. And I think you know, it's not hard to find an in-person writers meetup in Toronto or Vancouver. There's even a group here in the little suburb that I'm in that meets up. Um, but when you get further out, I feel like those opportunities are fewer and farther between. So, for people who are living in those more rural areas where they can't just hop in their car and go meet up with some folks at the library or wherever, or a coffee shop, what are some ways that they can build a community around them of other writers or other creatives? Do you have any suggestions for them?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about, I think the pandemic really taught me a lot about that we have Zoom fatigue and everything else that we talk about in the world, but it did sort of open up doors for online courses for writers.
Yeah.
So I've taken online courses for poets through the pandemic and afterwards, and that sort of is cool because you can spend a Sunday afternoon with people from across the country. That would never have happened before.
No.
Oh. Um, and then you make friends. You find people who are like-minded and your souls kind of resonate. And so then you connect with people. And I think just in towns, I know like we have Sudbury Writers Guild, there are regional writers guilds across the country. There are places like TWUC or the Canadian Authors Association or the League of Canadian Poets and the Playwrights Guild of Canada. These organizations work to sort of create community inside those rural areas. That's something I'm really interested in working on when I become chair of TWUC next
Hmm.
year, just to think about how a lot of writers tend to gravitate towards bigger centers like Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, and then smaller places, even like Halifax, St. John's, Sudbury. Beyond that, Timmins, North Bay, the Sioux, in my neck of the woods in Northern
Hmm.
Ontario, Yellowknife.
Hmm.
We can't forget that people are up there writing, up here writing, and that to pull them together. So I know, we've done a lot of work at TWUC with sort of creating communities in those smaller areas, and I hope we continue to do that. I think we have so many stories across Canada that need to be written and published, and I sometimes worry that not all stories are heard. That's why I love Latitude 46. It's a Northern Ontario press. And so this story of mine, about this family just before World War II might not have been heard anywhere else except for a press that is willing to speak up and give a stage to Northern writers. So there's a gap and there's a hole in rural literature and
Hmm.
public.
And yet some
Yeah.
of our best stories are in those places. Like I just
Yeah.
think most of us who live in cities now, our families are not city families. My
Well,
relatives were all farmers and
yeah.
or immigrants who wound up on farmland who didn't necessarily want to be farmers.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of uh, stories that need to be told. And I just want to ask you one more question because just you mentioned the press, the Latitude 64 press that you are working with. Like, I think we think that there's like Penguin Random House and HarperCollins, and then if you don't get published with them, there's nobody else out there. But how do you go about finding all these small little presses out there? Because there are a lot of them and they are out there, but how do you find them? How do you
Well,
hear about them?
I'm hoping that people need to read Canadian books. So,
Mm,
yes, go to the big publishers for sure. And there are some Canadian writers published by the big publishers, but there are such great small Canadian presses. Like, so my earlier books were published by people like Penumbra, um, um, Peddler, they're both P words, Black Moss out of Windsor, and then Frontenac out of Calgary, and now Turnstone out of Winnipeg. So there's ECW, there's Book Hug, there's so many presses I can't name them all. So Woolsack and Wynn, there's Caitlin Press in BC. There's, loads of presses across the country. They're out there on the internet. And when you pick up small press work, you're supporting Canadian presses and authors, and that's really key. Also, just to support indie bookstores across Canada if you can. I
yeah.
think to go small rather than large. Like the default is let's go to the big, fat, glorious bestseller by a big press or go to a big bookstore. I would say no, you should look for the small gems in presses across Canada because there's so many great little presses and they're just as amazing as these bigger ones. So I'm not really, but I guess in the writing community, we might be more aware of that than
I
people who
think,
are readers.
yes. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think that's the thing is as
Yeah.
readers, and I know a lot of our listeners are also readers, even if they're not
Yes.
writers, but
Yeah.
it's just not knowing that there's other options out there. A lot of people are aware that they can self-publish and that's a viable option too. But
Yeah.
um, yeah, there are other people out there who are willing to read what you've written and help you
Yes.
turn it into something that others
Yes,
can
dig
read.
around, dig around. Go. The best thing I could say is find your indie bookstore and go in there and ask whoever the bookseller is, because indie bookstore booksellers are brilliant readers and they
Yeah.
know you could pick one. I'm sure you're thinking of one that even. If you go in and you know the person who's always there, who reads voraciously, who can point you to a story that's set in Eastern Canada, they will take you to what a press that likely is a smaller Canadian press by an author you might not have heard of before. Doesn't mean that they're not fantastic.
Yeah. Hidden gems, right?
Yeah, there's so many fantastic Canadian writers out there. It's a wonderful buffet.
It is something for everyone.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so before we wrap up here, why don't you tell us a little bit about what's next for you? You've mentioned you have another poetry collection coming out in the spring. You've just finished work on a draft of your
Yeah.
next novel. So what do you see happening in the next year or two for you?
Well, my next book is a book of bee poetry. So it's looking at bees in terms of their being threatened by climate crisis and climate change. And also it's examining mythopoetic ideas around bees, and also the bee as sort of like a symbol of, oh my goodness, um, sort of the transformational time that you go through as a menopausal, perimenopausal woman. So there's a lot of feminist stuff in there.
My
It's kind
name
of
means
like,
honeybee in Greek. That's what
that's it.
Melissa means. And yes, in Greek,
Oh,
Melissa
that's
means
wild.
Emily means honeybee.
Totally poetic
Yeah.
divination happening here.
So I've always thought, I've been thinking about getting a tattoo since I was like 16, and I've never been able to come up with one that I think I could sit with for the rest of my life. But the one that kind of does come into my head every now and then is like, well, you could do a honeybee. That like makes
Good.
sense. So
I just got one from, well, I got one a couple of years ago, with some barn swallows for my parents and my grandmother, and then the words "no lay to Mary," which were Seamus Heaney's last words. So be not
oh, that's
afraid.
cool. That's
Yeah.
cool. Yeah,
So you
very
could
cool.
if I could do that after all these years of me being afraid of them, you can totally do a honeybee, I think.
Yeah, it's not the fear of getting the tattoo, and I have a cousin who's a tattoo artist
Oh,
who I think would
perfect.
do it, but it's just
Yeah.
more like, will I hate it? 10 years from now, will I be thinking like, why did I do this? But anyway, yeah, so I will have to read your
Cool.
book of bee poetry.
Excellent. Thanks.
And your next novel, do you have like an estimated date for that, or is that still a little ways away?
I'm writing the last part of the end of it. So I feel that there's 50 pages left, and then that's the first draft. So then
Okay.
I imagine the next like 6 to 7 months sending it to a couple of writer friends to read for
Yeah.
me. And then I'll start sending it out probably next fall, I think next summer, maybe. We'll see how it goes. I always have timelines, otherwise I just won't move forward. And then, but
Right.
it's fairly close to being, that draft is almost done. And I've done a lot more work on it. I think now that I've gone through the 10-year novel writing process with the Donoghue Girl, I'm much more clean and confident in my writing for the second one.
Yeah. You'll be able
Yeah,
to cut down the timeline a
I
little
hope
bit.
so.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Kim. Where can people find you out on the wild internet, world of the wild? Anyway, where can people find you on the internet?
They'll find me at my website. So it's just www.kimfahner.com.
Okay, and we will put links to that, of course,
That's
in the show
great.
notes. And I will try to put as many links to all of the authors that you mentioned throughout the interview, because you mentioned some really great names that I'm
Good.
sure people will want to check out. And we will also make sure we put a link to where they can find your book as well, your newest novel. So that was great. Yes,
Thank
thank you
you so
so
much. It was so much fun.
This was fun and I really enjoyed it. And yeah, I'm so glad that we could have this opportunity to chat. So, for all of you listening, that is it for this week. We will be back with another brand new episode for season 6 in 2 weeks. But in the meantime, we will be continuing on with the Prep for the Holidays minisode series that you can listen to every Thursday between now and the end of the year. So that is it for this week. Thank you all so much for listening, and we will talk to you all soon.